So, Dave Rubin, in my opinion, is one of the more harmful figures in American political discourse because he pretends to be a liberal while espousing right-wing and conservative talking points, so that kind of gives him this sort of credibility among conservatives when he basically denounces and lies about the left. Now, since he started taking money from the Koch brothers, since his program was sponsored by Learn Liberty, he began growing increasingly conservative because he is the definition of a sellout. So he recently did what he's been doing for the past few months. He went on Fox News and he decided to speak about the left and listen to the implication of what he's saying about the left and where they're headed in terms of violence and discourse.
So, Dave, the problem I have with the rhetoric is that it makes any kind of intelligent conversation impossible. I do think that there are real issues at the heart of the Putin-Trump summit, and you can have whatever view you want on them, but they seem like they're worth discussing. The second you start calling people traitors, accusing them of a felony, how can you talk those issues through?
Yeah, well, first off, it's always good to be with you, Tucker, you racist, homophobic Nazi, you. So,
it's unbelievable.
On that note, yes, the rhetoric on both sides, but particularly the left, has been ramped up to a point where we're basically getting to the place where we will be excusing violence if it's not excused already.
Yes.
And this mob mentality that we've talked about a bunch of times before, it's spreading everywhere. And I did a video a couple months back how internet culture is becoming mainstream culture. The trolling and attacking and fighting that used to be relegated just to the sort of basement of the internet is now leaking out everywhere, and our politicians are now telling people to troll people at their homes and dox people and all of this awful stuff. I mean, just a great sort of simple example that I can give you is when I was on the car ride over here tonight to do this show, a Hollywood director, actor, producer, great guy who I know, who's a lefty, who you would disagree with on a ton of stuff, a guy by the name of Mark Duplass, who's a great guy who I've had on my show, who's been reaching across the aisle trying to say to the liberals and the left, guys, let's try to be a little more tolerant. He put out a tweet basically saying, you might want to follow conservative Ben Shapiro. He's a decent guy, and maybe it'll open up your eyes to some stuff. I'm paraphrasing, basically. The amount of hate that he got caused the guy to delete the tweet because the mob just goes after anyone that dares say, let's be tolerant. And if that's really where we're at right now, then yeah, what you've been talking about on this show for quite some time about this all escalating to violence, if we can't talk, then the only thing left is violence. And I'm doing everything I can to avoid that. I think you're trying to do it. And I think there's a bunch of other people trying to do it too. And we've just got to get louder and keep showing people that that's truly the answer here.
I hate violence. And if you ever hear me excusing it, I hope you call me on it because it's wrong. Dave, thank you.
I promise you I will.
So if you've been listening to Dave Rubin recently, that shouldn't be too surprising to you, but it's still really problematic. And I think one of the more problematic things that he said, and it's also not based in reality, but the overall assumption here was that this rhetoric surrounding Donald Trump, it's gotten a little bit extreme, right? And Tucker Carlson said that, this talk of him being a treasonous traitor, it's really problematic. Now, I get that Russiagate hysteria is a problem. We have individuals trying to paint the DNC hacks as an attack comparable to Pearl Harbor. That's problematic. But in talking about the left's rhetoric, I mean, you can't just dismiss hysteria on the right with regard to Obama. They called him a Muslim. They called him a communist. They compared him to Hitler. They freaked out when he wouldn't salute a soldier or did a half-assed salute. They freaked out when he wore a tan suit. I mean, to say that the left can be hysterical when it comes to Trump, to talk about Trump derangement syndrome, you've got to also talk about Obama derangement syndrome, because hysteria is something that we always see. I mean, it's something that's going to become a lot more common. It's just one of the consequences of a polarized society. But the goal here is to paint the left as the hysterical Looney Tunes And Dave Rubin started the interview by saying, "Tucker, it's always good to be with you, you racist, homophobic Nazi." And he says this to imply that the left is intolerant, because anyone that they disagree with, they just resort to, lobbing these attacks at them. They're sexist, they're homophobic. But if you really dive into the details there, you'll see that we're not just throwing those words around. I mean, certainly neoliberal centrist Democrats are doing that. They call Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders supporters sexist Bernie bros. But generally speaking, I think that when you call someone who's against marriage equality a bigot or homophobic, I think that's a pretty accurate descriptor. When you call someone who is against immigrants and even legal immigration a xenophobe or a racist, I think that's a pretty accurate descriptor. But there's no nuance here. Just the fact that you're calling someone a racist or a homophobe or a Nazi, to Dave Rubin, they're all the same. You can't separate the legitimate accusations from the illegitimate accusations. This is just, what the left always does. They smear, they lie. But when he's talking about the problems with the left, when he's talking about how the left is kind of poised to become violent, well, he doesn't mention violence on the right. And in fact, David Dole of the Rational National did a great job pointing out how Dave Rubin didn't even mention once the violent attack that a right-wing terrorist carried out last year that killed Heather Heyer. But in spite of that, in spite of him ignoring the right, he states, we're basically getting to the place where we will be excusing violence. Now, of course, what he's talking about is violence on the left. He also states internet culture is becoming mainstream culture. The trolling and attacking and fighting that used to be relegated to the sort of basement of the internet is now leaking out everywhere, and our politicians are now telling people to troll people at their homes and dox people and all of this awful stuff. Now, what he's referencing there is Maxine Waters saying that if you see a Trump official in public, you should protest them. She did not suggest that you troll or dox people. She suggested that you protest people. Now, in talking about how intolerant the left has become, how they're always protesting, right-wing speakers on college campuses, he never speaks about the left-wingers who are disinvited from college campuses. He doesn't talk about how right-wing universities like the Bob Jones University never invites liberal speakers. He doesn't like to talk about intolerance on the right, which obviously it's a lot more prevalent on the right, even if you have authoritarian-minded SJWs. Well, right-wing intolerance is obviously much more problematic. That's not even controversial. If Dave Rubin wanted to test this, all he had to do was meet with one of his, newfound evangelical friends and try to hold his husband's hand in front of them or kiss him in front of them. And he'd see who's real fucking intolerant pretty quickly. But he states here, another way to prove his point is he invoked the example of Mark Duplass, who recommended Ben Shapiro to people, but then he states the mob went crazy because they just go after anyone that dares to say, let's be tolerant. Now, the goal here overall was to convey that the left is just intolerant of anyone that disagrees with them. In fact, that's a quote that he said. And his overall goal was to not so subtly suggest that the left is on the cusp of becoming violent, given how intolerant they've become. But he's ignoring a really inconvenient fact. Left-wing violence, when you compare that to right-wing extremism and violence, there's no competition. Since September 12th of 2001, nearly half of all deaths related to terrorism have been carried out by far right-wing extremists at 47%. Now, radical Islamic terrorism has killed more people overall, largely due to the attack on Pulse nightclub, but there's been more separate incidents of terrorism by far-right extremists than there has even been of radical Islamic extremism. Right-wing extremists have carried out 74% of all terrorist attacks since 2001. Now, the Anti-Defamation League disaggregated incidents of right-wing terrorism, and they found that 43% of those instances of violence are from white supremacist terrorists. 42% are carried out by anti-government extremists, groups like the Sovereign Citizens Movement. 11% come from anti-abortion extremists, and then you have anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant extremists accounting for less than 5% overall. So the rhetoric you see surrounding abortion, white supremacy, anti-Muslim bigotry, xenophobic rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric, is more likely statistically and factually to lead to violence on the right than anything the left says or does. But yet, according to Dave Rubin, it's the left who's on the cusp of becoming more violent. And he claims that they're less tolerant than even right-wingers. So you'd say that Mike Pence is more tolerant of your homosexual lifestyle, dipshit? Is that honestly what you're going to say? I mean, this is an individual who, his argument is goofy specifically because it's not his own argument. I mean, Dave Rubin, even though he claims to be a liberal, is nothing more than a right-wing Republican Party hack. He's doing the bidding of right-wing extremists. He brings on individuals who are right-wing extremists, lets them say whatever they want, spew whatever bullshit they want, doesn't check them at all. So if anyone is responsible for violence, it's right-wingers. And if he wants to blame the left, he needs to look in the fucking mirror and see what he's doing by enabling these alt-right lunatics on his own shitty show.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.